I was about to marry the wrong woman when fate stopped my car at a red light. The engine purred beneath my hands, smooth and expensive, like everything else in my life. And beside me, Victoria was talking about seating charts and vineyard reservations. Her voice polished, perfect, forgettable, while Manhattan moved around us in a blur of headlights and reflections on rain-slick asphalt. And I remember thinking how quiet everything felt inside my chest despite the noise outside. Like I had built an empire so loud it drowned out something essential, something human. And then the light turned red and the world slowed down in a way I couldn't explain, not logically, not rationally, just a shift in the air, a pause that felt deliberate, like the city itself was holding its breath. And that's when I saw her, stepping off the curb into the crosswalk, her coat too thin for the cold, her hair pulled back the way it used to be when she didn't have time to care, and for a second my mind refused to recognize her, refused to connect the memory of who she was with the reality of who she had become. But my body knew before I did. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, my breath stalled halfway in, and everything Victoria was saying dissolved into silence. Because Emily Carter was supposed to be gone. She was supposed to be a closed chapter, a mistake I buried under money and power and decisions I never looked back on. But there she was, walking across my path like she had never left, like time hadn't passed, except it had, because she wasn't alone, and I didn't understand it at first, not fully, just shapes moving beside her, smaller figures holding onto her hands. And then one of them looked up, just for a second, just long enough for something inside me to crack open in a way I couldn't control, because those eyes, that exact shade, that quiet intensity, it was like looking into a mirror of a life I never lived, and suddenly the car felt too small, the air too thin, the past too close, and I couldn't hear the traffic anymore, couldn't hear Victoria calling my name. Couldn't hear anything except the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and uneven, as Emily froze mid-step, her gaze locking onto mine across the painted white lines, and there was no surprise in her expression, no confusion, just something deeper, something resigned, like she had been waiting for this moment even if she never wanted it to come. And I realized, with a certainty that didn't need proof or explanation, that whatever life I thought I was driving toward had just collided with the one I left behind. And this time, there was no way to turn the wheel and avoid it. I should have stayed in the car, should have let the light turn green and driven forward into the life I had already chosen. But my hand moved before my mind could catch up, fingers tightening around the door handle as something deeper than logic pulled me out of my seat, and the cold air hit my face the second I stepped onto the pavement, sharp and grounding, but not enough to steady the chaos building inside my chest, because Emily was still there, still frozen halfway across the crosswalk. The city moving around her like she was the only still point in a world that refused to stop, and those two children stood close to her sides, their small hands gripping hers like anchors, like they belonged there, like they had always belonged there. And I took one step forward, then another, each one heavier than the last, like I was walking into something irreversible, something I could not control with money or influence or the quiet authority that usually bent the world to my will. And for the first time in years, I felt uncertain, not about a deal or a decision, but about something far more dangerous, something human, something I had buried so deep I convinced myself it no longer existed. And then I was standing in front of her, close enough to see the changes time had written across her face, the faint shadows under her eyes, the strength in the way she held herself, the quiet resilience that had always been there but now felt sharper, more defined. And she did not step back. She did not look away. She just held my gaze like she had nothing left to lose, and that unsettled me more than fear ever could, because I remembered the last time I saw her, the way she had looked at me then, broken and searching for something I refused to give. And now there was none of that, only distance, only finality, and I realized too late that I was the one who had been left behind. Emily, I said, her name unfamiliar on my tongue after all these years, like it belonged to a version of me I barely recognized, and the sound of it seemed to ripple through the moment, because one of the children shifted slightly, glancing between us with quiet curiosity, and I could not stop myself from looking closer, from noticing the details that should not have mattered but suddenly meant everything. The shape of his eyes, the way he held his shoulders, the subtle tilt of his head that felt achingly familiar, and something inside me tightened to the point of pain. Because this was not coincidence, this was not chance, this was something far more deliberate, something that had been kept from me, something that had grown in the space I left behind without ever knowing it existed, and I swallowed, trying to find words that made sense in a moment, that refused to be controlled. Who are they? I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, stripped of its usual certainty, and for a second, just a second, I saw it in her eyes, the flicker of something vulnerable, something she quickly buried beneath the calm exterior she had built, and she shifted her grip on the children's hands, grounding herself before answering. They are mine, she said, steady, measured, final. And the way she said it told me everything and nothing at the same time. Because she did not deny what I was thinking. She did not clarify it either. She just placed a boundary between us that felt both protective and deliberate. And behind me, I could hear Victoria's voice calling my name again. Closer now, sharper, confusion creeping into every syllable. But I did not turn around. I could not. Not when the truth was standing right in front of me, breathing, watching, waiting, and I realized in that moment that whatever I had built, whatever future I thought I was securing, meant nothing if this question remained unanswered, if this connection remained unresolved, because power had never prepared me for this, for the possibility that I had lost something I never even knew I had. And as the light changed and the traffic around us began to move again, I understood with a clarity that cut deeper than anything else that this was not a coincidence. This was a reckoning, and it had just found me in the middle of a crosswalk. The world did not wait for me to understand. It never does. Traffic surged forward with impatient horns and flashing headlights. People moving around us with annoyed glances, as if we were nothing more than an inconvenience in their perfectly timed routines. But I stood there, rooted in place, because walking away felt impossible now, like turning my back on something that had already claimed me whether I was ready or not. And Emily shifted first, her eyes flicking briefly past me toward the sound of Victoria's approaching footsteps, and I saw it then. The calculation, the quiet decision forming behind her gaze, the instinct to protect, to retreat, to end this before it could begin, and that instinct told me more than any answer she could have given. Because people only run when there is something worth hiding, and before I could stop myself, I stepped closer, lowering my voice so the world could not hear what did not belong to it. Do not walk away from me again, I said, the words coming out softer than command but heavier than a request, and her jaw tightened just slightly. Not fear, not submission, something stronger, something that had learned to stand without me. I am not the one who walked away, she replied. And the truth in that sentence landed harder than anything else, because she was right. I had been the one to choose distance, to choose control over connection, to decide that what we had was not worth the risk it posed to everything else I was building. And now that decision stood in front of me in the form of two small lives I had never known, and I felt something unfamiliar press against my ribs, something dangerously close to regret. Emily. I tried again, but one of the children shifted closer to her, his fingers tightening around her coat, his eyes lifting to meet mine with a quiet awareness that did not belong to someone his age, and it unsettled me in a way I could not explain, because there was recognition there, not of who I was, but of what I represented, like he could sense the tension in the air, the weight of something unspoken, and I crouched slightly without thinking, lowering myself to his level, because standing above him suddenly felt wrong. Like distance was no longer an option I could hide behind, and for a brief second, the world narrowed to just that moment, his gaze steady, mine searching, and I saw it again, undeniable now, the reflection of something that belonged to me, not taught, not influenced, but inherited, and my chest tightened as I straightened, looking back at Emily with a question I could no longer keep contained. How old are they? I asked, and she hesitated, just enough for the silence to stretch, just enough for the answer to become obvious before she even spoke. They are 3, she said finally, and time folded in on itself, because 3 years ago was not just a number, it was a moment, a decision, a night I had convinced myself meant nothing beyond what it was, and now it stood in front of me as something permanent, something living, something I could not erase or negotiate or rewrite. And behind me Victoria's presence closed in, her hand touching my arm, her voice tight with confusion and something sharper beneath it. "Alex, what is going on?" she asked, but I did not look at her, could not, because everything that mattered had shifted in the space of a single red light, and Emily took a small step back, her grip on the children firm but gentle, creating distance that felt both physical and final. "You have your life," she said quietly, not bitter, not accusing, just stating a fact that cut deeper because of its simplicity. "We are not part of it." And for the first time in years, I realized that control was an illusion, because no matter how much power I held, no matter how carefully I had constructed my world, there were moments like this that rewrote everything without permission. And as she turned slightly, guiding the children toward the other side of the street, I understood something with absolute clarity. I was not going to let her disappear again. Not this time. Not with answers still out of reach. Not with something this significant left unresolved. Because whatever she believed, whatever she had decided for both of us, this was no longer just her choice to make. And I stepped forward, ignoring the noise, the stares, the life I was supposed to return to, because the past was no longer behind me. It was walking away, and I was not ready to lose it twice. I moved after her without asking permission from anything or anyone. Not from the traffic. Not from Victoria's voice calling my name sharper now. Not even from the part of me that understood how dangerous it was to follow something I could not control. Because control had already slipped the moment I saw those children, and Emily did not turn around immediately. She just kept walking, steady, composed, like she had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times and decided exactly how it would end. And that realization hit me harder than anything else, because it meant she had expected me to come after her, expected this confrontation, and still chose to walk away, which meant whatever she was protecting mattered more than anything I could offer. And I closed the distance quickly, my steps longer, faster, until I reached her side just as she stepped onto the opposite curb. "Emily, stop," I said, not loud, but firm enough that it carried weight, and this time she did pause, just for a second, her shoulders tightening slightly before she turned her head, not fully facing me, just enough to acknowledge that I was still there, still refusing to disappear like I had before, and the children stayed close to her, one on each side, watching me with quiet curiosity, not fear, just awareness, like they could sense the shift in the air even if they did not understand it. And I forced myself to slow down, to match her pace instead of blocking her path, because something told me pushing too hard would make her run, and I could not risk that, not again. "You do not get to decide this alone," I said, the words measured, controlled, but carrying the weight of everything I had not said 3 years ago. And she let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief, just exhaustion. "I already did," she replied quietly, and the simplicity of that answer unsettled me more than anger would have, because it meant she had built a life without me, a complete one that did not need my approval or my presence to function, and that was something I had never truly considered, never allowed myself to imagine. And for a moment I did not know what to say, which was rare for me, unfamiliar and uncomfortable, because words had always been tools, precise and effective. But here they felt insufficient, like they could not bridge the gap that had formed between us, and I glanced down again at the children, really looked this time, not just at their faces but at the small details, the way one of them held a worn backpack slung over his shoulder, the other clutching a small toy car in his free hand. Ordinary things, simple, grounding, and yet they felt monumental because they existed in a life I had never been part of, and something tightened in my chest again, sharper now, more insistent. "Do they know?" I asked before I could stop myself, and she stilled completely at that, her steps halting as she finally turned to face me fully, her expression calm, but her eyes guarded, calculating every possible outcome of this conversation. "They know everything they need to know," she said, each word deliberate, and I nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding what she was not saying as much as what she was. And behind me, I could feel Victoria's presence closing in again, her heels clicking against the pavement, her confusion turning into something more pointed, more demanding. But I kept my focus on Emily, because this moment did not belong to anyone else, not anymore. 3 years, I said, more to myself than to her, the timeline settling into place with a clarity that left no room for denial. and she did not confirm it, did not need to, because the truth was already written in front of me, undeniable and alive, and I exhaled slowly, the weight of it pressing down in a way I had never experienced before, not in business, not in any negotiation or decision, because this was not something I could fix with strategy or influence. This required something else, something I was not used to offering, and I met her gaze again, steady this time, certain. I am not walking away from this, I said, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as a statement of fact, and for the first time since I had seen her, something flickered in her expression, not fear, not anger, something closer to conflict, like a part of her had always known this would happen, always known I would not let it end here. And the city kept moving around us, indifferent, relentless, but in that moment none of it mattered, because whatever came next was going to change everything, and I could feel it settling into place, inevitable as the turning of the light, impossible to stop once it had begun. Victoria reached us before Emily could respond, her presence cutting through the moment with a sharp clarity that felt almost intrusive, like reality forcing its way back into something that had been suspended too long, and her hand slid around my arm with practiced familiarity, her grip light but possessive, a silent claim that suddenly felt misplaced. "Alex," she said, her voice controlled but strained at the edges, her eyes moving quickly between Emily and the children, assessing, calculating, trying to understand a situation that refused to fit into anything predictable, and I felt the shift immediately, the tension tightening, the contrast becoming impossible to ignore, because Victoria belonged to the life I had chosen, polished, structured, safe in a way that required nothing unpredictable, while Emily stood in front of me with everything I had not planned, everything I had not prepared for. And for the first time I saw both worlds clearly at once, not as separate paths, but as something colliding in real time. And Victoria's gaze sharpened slightly as it landed on the children, her expression softening out of instinct rather than understanding. "Who are they?" she asked, the same question I had asked minutes ago, but it sounded different coming from her, lighter, detached, like it was a curiosity rather than a revelation, and Emily's posture shifted subtly, her shoulders straightening, her chin lifting just enough to create distance, to establish a boundary that was no longer just between her and me, but between her and everything I represented, and I could see it in her eyes, the way she measured Victoria in a single glance, taking in the tailored coat, the effortless confidence, the life that looked easy from the outside, and something unreadable passed through her expression before it settled back into calm. "They are my children," she said again, steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and Victoria nodded slowly, polite, composed. But I could feel the question forming behind her silence, the one she had not asked yet but would, because she was not someone who ignored inconsistencies, not in business, not in life, and I knew that if I did not speak now, the moment would slip again, become something controlled by others instead of me, and I stepped slightly forward, positioning myself just enough to face Emily directly, not blocking her, but not letting her disappear either. "We need to talk," I said, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that this conversation was not optional, and Emily's lips pressed together for a brief second, the only sign of tension she allowed to show. "There is nothing to talk about," she replied, but the firmness in her tone felt more like defense than truth, and I shook my head slightly, not accepting that, not anymore, because walking away had been my mistake once, and I was not repeating it. "There is everything to talk about," I said, my gaze dropping briefly to the children before returning to her, letting the implication settle without needing to be spoken out loud. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow again, the noise fading, the movement around us becoming background to something far more important, and Emily's eyes flickered, not to me, but to the children, checking them, grounding herself, making sure they were still close, still safe, and that instinct told me more than anything else, because it meant her priority was not avoiding me. It was protecting them, and that shifted something inside me, something that felt unfamiliar but undeniable. Because for the first time this was not about control or possession or even the past. This was about responsibility, about something that existed whether I was ready for it or not. And I took a breath, steadying myself in a way I rarely had to, Just 5 minutes, I said, softer now, less command, more request. And that change mattered. I could see it in the way her expression shifted. Slightly, the resistance not disappearing but becoming less absolute, less rigid. And behind me Victoria's hand tightened around my arm just enough to remind me she was still there, still watching, still waiting for answers of her own. And I realized in that moment that whatever happened next would not just change one life, it would unravel several. Because the truth had a way of doing that, of exposing everything at once whether you were prepared or not. And Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction as she made a decision, one that felt reluctant but inevitable. 5 minutes, she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, and it was not permission, not agreement, just a pause in the escape she had planned. But it was enough, more than enough, because it meant she was not running, not yet, and now that was all I needed. We stepped out of the flow of people and into a narrow pocket of quiet beside a closed storefront, the glass behind us reflecting 3 versions of a life that should never have intersected, and for a second no one spoke. Not me, not Emily, not even the city seemed to intrude, because 5 minutes suddenly felt like both too much and not enough, and I looked at the children again, closer now, noticing the details I had missed before, the way one of them leaned slightly into Emily's side without thinking, the other watching me with careful curiosity, not afraid, just aware, and that steadiness unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant they were used to navigating the world without uncertainty, without hesitation, like they had learned early that stability came from within, not from anything external, and that realization pressed against something inside me that I could not ignore anymore. What are their names? I asked, my voice quieter now, stripped of everything except the need to understand, and Emily hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. Liam and Noah, she said, and the names settled into me in a way that felt immediate, like they had always been there waiting to be spoken, and I repeated them silently in my head, grounding myself in something real, something undeniable, and I nodded once, slowly, before meeting her gaze again. Emily, look at me, I said, not commanding, just asking, and she did, reluctantly, her eyes steady but guarded, like she was bracing for something she had already decided she would not give. And I took a breath, feeling the weight of the next words before they even formed, because this was not something I could circle around, not something I could approach indirectly. Are they mine? I asked, and the question landed between us with a quiet finality that made everything else irrelevant. The noise, the movement, even the presence of Victoria just a few feet away. All of it faded because there was only one answer that mattered now, and Emily closed her eyes for a brief second, just long enough for me to see the truth before she even spoke, just long enough to confirm what I already knew, and when she opened them again, there was no avoidance, no denial, just acceptance. Yes, she said. Simple, clear, unshakable, and the world did not explode. Nothing dramatic happened, but something inside me shifted so completely it felt like the ground had moved beneath my feet, because that one word rewrote everything. Every decision I had made, every path I thought I was on, every version of myself I had accepted as complete, and for a moment I could not speak, could not think beyond the realization that I had children, not in theory, not in possibility, but standing right in front of me, breathing, watching, existing without me for 3 years. And I let out a slow breath, the kind that felt like it carried more than air, like it carried the weight of something I had never acknowledged before, and I glanced down at them again, really seeing them now, not as strangers, not as possibilities, but as something that belonged to me in a way nothing else ever had. And it was not ownership, not control, it was something quieter, heavier, something that came with responsibility whether I had asked for it or not. And I looked back at Emily, my voice steadier now, more certain. Why did you not tell me? I asked, not accusing, just needing to understand the choice she had made, and she held my gaze without flinching. Because you made it clear you did not want anything that complicated your life, she said, and the words were not sharp, not angry, just honest, and that honesty cut deeper than anything else, because I could not deny it, not fully, not truthfully. I had chosen simplicity, control, distance, and she had respected that in the only way she knew how, by removing herself completely, by building something without me instead of waiting for me to change, and I exhaled slowly, absorbing that, accepting it in a way I had never had to accept anything before, and behind me I could feel Victoria's presence again. The silence she held now no longer confused but tense, expectant, and I knew that whatever I said next would not just affect Emily or the children, it would fracture the life I had been standing in just minutes ago. And for the first time, I did not try to calculate the outcome, did not try to control the narrative. I just looked at Emily and said the only thing that mattered. This changes everything. And I meant it, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a truth I could not ignore anymore. Victoria's silence broke first, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet sharpness that cut through everything that had just been said. "Alex," she repeated, slower this time, like she needed to anchor me back into the version of reality she understood, and I turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence, because ignoring her completely felt impossible now, not after everything that had just shifted. And her eyes searched mine, not for affection, not even for reassurance, but for truth, something real in a moment that had clearly unraveled beyond her control. "What does that mean?" she asked, and the question was simple, but it carried weight, because it was not just about the children, it was about us, about the future we had been planning minutes ago like it was inevitable. And I realized then that there was no version of this conversation where I could protect everyone, no careful balance that would keep everything intact, and for the first time, I did not try to soften it, did not try to redirect, I just answered. "It means I have 2 sons, I said, the words settling into the air with a finality that made everything else secondary, and I saw it in her expression, the exact moment the truth landed, the shift from confusion to understanding, from understanding to something quieter, something more complicated, and she nodded once, slowly, like she was processing it in real time, adjusting her expectations with the precision she always had. But there was something else there too, something that did not belong to logic or control, something human, something that could not be negotiated away, and she glanced at Emily, at the children, then back at me. "And you just found out," she said, not as a question, but as a statement, and I nodded, because anything else would have been dishonest, and honesty felt like the only thing I had left to offer in a moment like this. And she exhaled, a measured breath that carried more than just air, like she was letting go of something she had not fully named yet, and I watched her carefully, because I knew this mattered, not in the way business decisions mattered, but in the way consequences mattered, the kind that stayed, the kind that reshaped everything after the moment passed. And she straightened slightly, her posture returning to something composed, something controlled, but not untouched. "I need to think," she said quietly, and there was no accusation in it, no immediate reaction, just distance, just space. And for a second, I felt something close to respect for that, because she was not reacting emotionally. She was choosing clarity over impulse, something I had always valued, but this time it felt different, because clarity meant separation, meant stepping back from something that no longer made sense the way it had before. And she released my arm slowly, the absence of her touch more noticeable than the contact had been, and I understood without needing her to say it that whatever we had planned, whatever we had assumed would happen next, was no longer certain, not after this, not after everything had shifted so completely. And she looked at me one last time, her gaze steady, searching, like she was memorizing something before deciding whether to keep it or let it go. "Call me later," she said, and then she turned, her heels moving with the same precision they always had. But there was a difference now, a slight hesitation in her step that had not been there before, and I watched her walk away, not stopping her, not calling her back, because I knew this was something she needed to process on her own, something I could not fix or control. And when she disappeared into the crowd, I turned back to Emily, to Liam and Noah, to the reality that had replaced everything else. And for a moment none of us spoke, because the absence of Victoria left a different kind of silence behind, one that felt heavier, more real, like there was nothing left to distract from what mattered now. And I looked at Emily, really looked at her, not as someone from my past, not as a complication, but as the person who had carried something this significant alone for 3 years, and I felt something shift again, something quieter this time, but just as undeniable. "You did this by yourself," I said, not questioning, just acknowledging, and she nodded once, her expression steady. I had to, she replied, and there was no pride in it, no resentment, just truth, and I absorbed that, letting it settle, understanding it in a way I had not allowed myself to understand anything before. And then I looked down at the boys again, at the life that existed because of choices I had made and consequences I had never faced, and I realized that whatever came next was not about reclaiming something. It was about stepping into something I had never been part of, something I had to earn, not take. And I met Emily's gaze again, my voice quieter now, but more certain than it had ever been. I am not going anywhere, I said, not as a promise to control, but as a commitment to stay. And this time, I meant it. The city seemed louder after Victoria left, like the world had rushed back in to fill the space she had occupied. But somehow it still felt quieter between us, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. And Emily shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her grip on Liam and Noah's hands, a subtle movement that told me she was preparing to leave again, not out of panic, not out of fear, but because standing here any longer risked opening something she had worked hard to keep closed, and I could see it in the way her eyes moved, not restless, but aware, always calculating what was safest for them, not for herself, never for herself, and that realization stayed with me, heavier than anything else, because it meant her decisions had never been about avoidance, they had been about protection, and I stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her, just aligning myself with her direction, making it clear without saying it that I was not here to stop her from moving forward, only to walk with her if she allowed it. And for a moment she hesitated, her gaze flicking to me, measuring that shift, trying to understand what it meant, and I kept my posture open, controlled, but not imposing, because this was not a situation I could dominate. It was one I had to earn my place in, and after a second, she started walking again, slower this time, not rushing, not escaping, just moving, and I matched her pace without asking, staying just close enough to be present, but not close enough to crowd her. And the boys moved with her naturally, their steps small but steady, and after a few seconds, one of them glanced up at me again, this time not just curious, but thoughtful, like he was trying to understand where I fit into this picture, and I met his gaze, softer than I had ever allowed myself to be, because something told me this mattered more than anything I had ever negotiated. Hi, I said quietly, not to both of them, just to him, because he was the one watching, the one processing, and he blinked once, considering me, before giving a small nod in return, not shy, not afraid, just acknowledging. And something about that simple response settled into me deeper than it should have, like a door opening just a fraction, enough to let something reel in, and I let out a slow breath, not realizing I had been holding it, and beside him, the other child adjusted the toy car in his hand, rolling the small wheels with his thumb absent-mindedly, grounded in something familiar, something safe, and I noticed that too. Every detail suddenly feeling significant, every small action. Something I wanted to remember, to understand, to be part of, and Emily glanced at me again, her expression softer now, not fully open, not fully closed, just uncertain in a way that mirrored something inside me. And she spoke after a moment, her voice quieter than before. This is not something you can step into for a day and then walk away from, she said, not accusing, not warning, just stating a truth that carried weight. And I nodded immediately, because there was no hesitation in me anymore, not after everything I had just seen, everything I had just learned. I know, I said, and for the first time, I meant it without calculation, without considering the cost or the outcome, just accepting the reality as it was, and she studied me for a second longer, like she was searching for something in my expression, something she could trust, something she could believe in, and I held her gaze, not forcing anything, just letting the moment exist as it was, and after a second, she looked away, not dismissing me, just processing, just thinking, and we kept walking, the city stretching out ahead of us, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, because this was not the same path I had been on minutes ago, it was something else entirely. Something unplanned, something real, and as the distance between where we had been and where we were going slowly grew, I realized that for the first time in years, I was not thinking about control, not thinking about outcomes or strategy, I was just present, just moving forward without knowing exactly what came next, and instead of unsettling me, that felt like the most honest thing I had experienced in a long time. We stopped in front of a small corner cafe. Nothing remarkable, just warm lights spilling through the windows and the faint sound of cups clinking inside. But it felt like a line had been drawn there, like this was where something new either began or ended, and Emily paused, her hand tightening slightly around Liam and Noah's before she looked at me again, her expression calm, but no longer guarded in the same way, more measured now, like she had shifted from defense to evaluation, and I understood that this was the moment that mattered more than anything I had said so far, because words were easy, staying was not, and she gestured toward a bench just outside the cafe, not inviting, not dismissing, just allowing space, and I took it without hesitation, sitting down slowly, aware of every movement, every choice, because this was not a negotiation I could win with strategy. This was something I had to show, not tell, and she guided the boys to sit beside her, one on each side. Again, the formation instinctive, protective, and I watched them for a second, noticing how they leaned into her without thinking, how their world was centered around her in a way that was complete, self-contained, and I realized that stepping into that meant understanding that I was not the center, not anymore, maybe never, and that thought should have unsettled me, but it did not, it grounded me instead, and I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands together, not imposing, not distant, just present. Tell me what you need, I said. The words simple, but they carried more weight than anything I had ever offered before, because I was not asking what I could take, I was asking what I had to give, and Emily studied me in silence for a long second, her eyes searching for something deeper than surface intention, something consistent, something real, and I did not look away, because I knew this was where everything would be decided, not in declarations, not in promises, but in whether she believed I could be more than the man who had left, and finally she spoke, her voice steady, deliberate, consistency, she said, and the word landed heavier than anything else, because it was not dramatic, not complicated, but it was everything. It meant showing up, staying, being there in ways that could not be proven in a single moment, and I nodded slowly, absorbing that, accepting it, without question, because for once there was no part of me looking for an easier answer, and she continued, her gaze briefly dropping to the boys before returning to me. They do not need grand gestures, they do not need explanations they cannot understand yet, they need stability, they need to know that if you step into their lives, you are not going to disappear again, and I felt that, deeply, because it was not just about them, it was about her too, about the years she had carried this alone, about the trust that had been broken before it was ever fully formed, and I exhaled slowly, letting that settle, letting it become something real instead of something abstract. I am not leaving, I said, and this time the words felt different, not like a claim, not like a promise meant to persuade, but like a decision that had already been made, and Liam shifted slightly beside her, glancing at me again, his small voice quiet but clear when he finally spoke. Are you going to come back? He asked, and the simplicity of the question hit harder than anything else, because it cut through everything, through history, through complexity, through all the things adults complicated, and I looked at him directly, not over him, not around him, but at him, meeting him where he was. Yes, I said, steady, certain, and he nodded once, like that was enough for now, like he would remember it and decide later if it was true, and something about that trust, that quiet acceptance without expectation, settled into me in a way nothing else had, and Emily watched that exchange carefully, her expression unreadable for a moment before it softened just slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to show that something had shifted, something small but real, and she looked away briefly, her gaze moving to the street, to the people passing by who had no idea that everything had just changed in this small corner of the city, and when she looked back at me, there was something new in her eyes, not trust yet, not forgiveness, but possibility. We will take this one step at a time, she said, and I nodded immediately, because that was the only way this could work, not all at once, not forced, just built slowly, deliberately, and I leaned back slightly, letting the moment breathe, not pushing further, not demanding more, because I understood now that this was not something I could control, it was something I had to be patient enough to earn, And as the light shifted outside, casting long shadows across the sidewalk, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about what I had lost or what I could gain. I was thinking about what I could become. And that felt like the beginning of something I had never allowed myself to consider before, something quieter, but infinitely more real.